Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Keren Berman. I'm the CEO of the American Society of the University of Haifa. Our communities and our countries are rife with complicated and nuanced conflicts on many levels, some of which have recently united important and powerful conversations and actions and reactions. Sadly, there are often no simple solutions that will satisfy all the constituents involved in any given situation. Today, we want to explore the psychology behind the concept of conflict, the dynamics of escalation and achieving peace. I'm honored to serve as moderator for today's panel, and we'll be joined by Dr. KEREN SHARVIT, head of the Program for Peace and Conflict Management at University of Haifa. Dr. SHARVIT is a social and political psychologist and a faculty member in the School of Psychological Sciences. She received her Ph.D. in social psychology from Tel Aviv University and spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow at the Swiss Center for Conflict Research Management and Resolution at Hebrew University. Her research focuses on the manner in which membership in a society involved in violent conflict shapes the mental processes of individuals and how these processes in turn shape individual and group behavior in determining how conflict unfolds. So thank you, Dr. SHARVIT, for being with us today, and thank you all for joining us. Before we jump into our questions, just a few notes of housekeeping. If you have any, we'll start with a quick conversation between Dr. SHARVIT and myself. And then if you have any questions, you can submit them via the Q&A on the bottom of the webinar. If you're on the telephone, you can email us at info@asuh.org. So thank you very much. Keren, Dr. SHARVIT, most conflicts do have interwoven layers of complexity. How do the complexity and multifaceted layers of any particular conflict, or the overlapping and coinciding of multiple conflicts with each other, impact the escalation?
Okay, first of all, hello everyone, and thanks for having me, and thanks for listening. One of the things I get asked very often by the students in our program for peace and conflict management is, how can you even say anything about conflicts in general? Conflicts are so complex. Each one of them is so different from each other. It's a different context, it's a different situation, it's different actors, different groups, different identities, and there's so many layers. How can you even make any sense of that? It's so complicated, and that's true. Each conflict has its own unique complexities, but at the same time, you know, that's the reason we are scientists. We study complex phenomena. So even though things are very, very complex, if you study them and use the systematic scientific methodologies, you can identify patterns within all of this complexity. We can still see certain things that do recur and that are typical of conflict, even very complex one. And from looking at it from the psychological point of view, one thing that many complex conflicts have in common is that they cause people a lot of distress and a lot of negative experiences people go through when they're part of a society that's involved in a conflict. And therefore, a lot of what shapes how they think about the conflict, how they feel about it, and how they react to it is their attempts to deal with the difficulties, because that's a natural human thing to do when people are faced with a difficult situation that's causing them a lot of distress. They try to find ways to deal with it, handle all of the complexity, and try to make sense of something that feels very very chaotic, very messy, very so that's a natural reaction. Clearly, when this comes at a time when there are also other sources of distress in place, say a global pandemic, then we see that pattern being strengthened even more. This feeling that I'm under a lot of pressure. I need to deal with a lot of difficult things. Bad things are happening all the time, and they're very unexpected, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So I need to be able to make sense of this one way or another. And we see this in research quite often that one simple way to try to make sense of these very difficult situations that people often tend to be attracted to is to get into the state of mind of there's an us and a them. The them are whoever we're blaming for all of this happening. So it's again a very natural thing to make sense of a very messy situation. Well, we get to blame somebody, right? It's somebody's fault. Somebody did this. That's them. And then there's of course us, who are the victims of the situation, the people that it happened to. We're,
Right.
the ones finding ourselves in this.
You've mentioned that, and in some of our conversations in preparing for this call, you've talked about this concept. You've also said, I think it's almost like a hero versus a villain mentality. An issue is that both sides often think they're the hero. So how do you reconcile those perspectives and approach some kind of de-escalation or create, a peaceful path forward, which is the point, when everybody always feels they're not just right, but actually the hero in the situation.
Right. So basically, that's what I was trying to say before. So very quickly, this very strong need to figure out, who's to blame and who's the good guy in the story becomes this comic book superhero story where there are good guys, the heroes, and the bad guys, the villains. Of course, us, whoever is on my side, we're the good guys in the story. We're the heroes, and opposite us are the villains. And the implication of that is, of course, superheroes in the comic book, they don't need permission to do whatever it takes to stop the villains. So basically, that gives us, this sense that, yes, we have to do whatever it takes to stop those villains that are that we're facing, that are these terrible people that are doing horrible things, that they must be stopped by any means necessary. And that leads to, people who tend to think of themselves as normal, ordinary people without very aggressive tendencies, finding themselves doing horrible things that they never would have imagined themselves doing. So that's the situation that we find ourselves when conflict escalates. How do you de-escalate that? Well, I think one first step towards that is precisely this understanding that that's a very simplified way of thinking, this heroes versus villains. That's how it works in the comic books. It's not how the world works. It's very, very, very rare that, there's one side that's absolutely right about everything and the other is absolutely wrong about everything. It's quite possible that things are more complex than that, that even the people on the other side, from their perspective, probably believe they're as right as we believe that we are right. So, and that's a very important first step towards understanding that we can go somewhere from here. So one helpful thing, it's not, if I say it right now, it sounds very simple. It's not simple at all, but it's to get people to the point where they're at least willing to listen and to hear and to understand how people on the other side are viewing the situation, and to realize that they're viewing it in a very, very different way from us. One other thing that's helpful is often to be able to realize that regardless of what we believe, and regardless of a very, very deep disagreement with, our story about what's happening and the other side's story about what's happening, as much as we're blaming them, they're blaming us for this situation. They think they're the superheroes and we're the villains. It's what we call a mirror image. As much as that's the case, it's usually also the case that everyone's suffering, everyone hurts, and that's actually something that I've researched quite a bit, and even in title of one. Well, it's actually not published yet. Something I'm hoping to get published soon. Put in the title, the song "Everybody Hurts Sometimes." most of the time when we're in a situation of conflict. And that's also something that we find is particularly useful, this realization that everyone's hurting and everyone wants to not hurt so much. So possibly if we see things this way, it's not just us who are hurting and people on the other side trying to hurt us, but there's people hurting over there also, and they're also hoping to reduce their suffering. That can put us in a position where we ask, so how do we make less suffering overall? And that becomes something that we have in common instead of something that we compete over, instead of, each side trying to say, we'll hurt them so that we hurt less, and they will try to hurt us so that they hurt less. How about we all hurt less?
Right.
And how about we figure out how to get to that point where we both hurt less? So that's another thing that's helpful in moving to towards de-escalation. Like I said, it sounds simple. It often takes a lot of hard work to get people to that point, because it goes against
so let's
what they're
right. Let's I wanted to sort of shift gears a little bit and get some practical advice from you. Based on, we have unfortunately, there's no shortage of real situations out there to apply your work in, and something we should get to before the call ends is why it's so important actually to teach, peaceful resolution. But from where you sit, looking at what's going on in the U.S., where right now we have many simultaneous tensions, many of which about the pandemic and the different responses that we've had. Each state is kind of treating it differently, how people are emerging from isolation, and now recent much more extreme racial tensions. What do you see as possible either strategies different people in the United States could have, whether it's our government or other social justice organizations could be using, or what do you take a step back and look at, say, here's what's actually going on behind the scenes, and you guys just don't know it yet, and you can just pick one of the tensions. I don't think we have enough time to get through all of them, but I would just love to hear your perspective.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I have to qualify things first. I'm not American, so
right. That's okay.
And no,
we comment on Israel all the time, and we're not Israeli, so it's okay.
Well, that's the point. That's the reason I want to qualify what I say first, because honestly, it sometimes annoys me that people come from the outside and I presume to have all the answers from
right.
Israel if we would just listen. It's different when you're in there and you're in the situation, and so I don't presume to be able to actually tell Americans
right.
what they're. I'm very much an outsider in the situation, so I can just speak of my observations and my thoughts, and I go back to what I was mentioning before. So I think a very important thing to keep in mind in going through it, and that goes for all of the actors that are involved, whether they're people that are protesting and that are activists, or whether they're decision makers that have more power to shape policy and to take action on a more official side. But I think of precisely what I was saying before. A very important thing to keep in mind: nobody is just the good guy, has everything right on their side. No one has the no one is only right and only justified. Different people that are or different parties, they all have from their own perspective, believe themselves to be justified, believe themselves to be on the side of right, and so that's something very important. It actually suggests that even though we believe what we believe very, very strongly, it's possible that we're wrong, at least partly, or it's possible that we're not seeing the full picture because we're, not in the other side's shoes, and they're seeing things differently, and that's their story, and we have our story, and none of those is absolutely right, and none of those is absolutely wrong. So I think that that's generally something to look at. And so when you're thinking about how you are moving towards de-escalation, the thinking is, okay, so a very important process to think about is, okay, so what do these people, assuming that they have their story and from their perspective, they think they're right, can I try to figure out what is it that they want? What is it that is bothering so much? And can I, consider that there's a different point of view than mine? And one of the very important things that we talk about in facilitating these processes is often moving the discussion, if we're getting to a discussion, but it doesn't even necessarily need to be at the stage where we're discussing things. It can be just something that I'm thinking about for myself before I even do anything, but moving from positions to interests. And by positions, we mean what people are demanding. So people can be demanding to defund the police, or they can be demanding to send the National Guard, or all sorts of things they could be demanding. These are positions. These are things they're saying that's what we want done. But often there's something, there are interests behind that in the sense that they're demanding these things because they are looking to fulfill something that they need, something that's very important to them. And if we try to figure out what that is, and sometimes we can do that, just by, observing and inquiring. And sometimes we can do that by discussing and listening and actually asking what is it that they actually want. And if we get a conversation to the point where we're asking what is it that we actually want instead of what we're demanding, it often is much easier to figure out that we can, first of all, there are many things that we all want, that we have in common. And for example, because everybody wants to be safe. So if we're talking at that level, instead of exactly what we need to do, then we can ask the question, how do we make everyone feel safe? How do we get to that situation? But in addition to that, we can move away from very, very strong positions and say, okay, maybe I don't need to demand exactly that. Maybe I can live with something different that the other side can live with too, if it fulfills my interest, if it gives me what I actually want, but in a different way. So I think that several things I'm saying. First of all is, beware of this position of I'm right and everyone else is wrong. Consider that there are different points of view and everybody can be right from their perspective. Have conversations or discussions to try to figure out what it is that the people on the other side actually want. And then, and again, move those discussions from positions to interests, which make it easier to find ways forward that everyone can live with, even if it's not what they necessarily wanted in the first place.
Right. So just even taking, and thank you, and going back to, I mean, I know you've studied in the US, but obviously, as you said, you're not American, but even just looking at some of the conflicts in Israel, which has had, the last year or 2 years, many elections, all sorts of demonstrations in the past, even, couple months on a number of topics, political, in support of what's going on here. What's kind of like a win, like, right? So, I mean, obviously in some cases, an outcome is very clear, whether it's right or wrong, but what's sort of a win if you were to look at something like that and say, here's a situation that's escalated, and what's the win when we de-escalate it? What's the path out for people? How do we know when we resolve something in a peaceful way?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a very happy answer to that
Okay.
because, yeah, we don't always have, an ultimate outcome that we are striving for.
Mhm.
Often it's a process. It can be a very, very, very long process of, especially when there's a very troubled with conflictual relationship with a history of a lot of animosity and violence and so on. It's not something that we at some point say is over, it's gone, we're past that. That's not how things work. Often it's a very, very long process. So sometimes when we're looking at something that's been intractable for a very, very intractable conflict is a concept that we use a lot, that has been stuck and for a very, very long time without getting out of it. That's something I discuss with my students a lot, actually, my PhD students. Just getting people to the point that they're willing, exactly what I said before, that they're willing to consider that, that there's a different point of view, and that different point of view might also be valid, even if I don't agree with it. But that's, in very tractable situation, a huge win. It doesn't solve everything, clearly.
Right.
It's very, very far from, but just to get people to be able to do that is very important. Just to be able to get people to the point where they're saying, okay, it's probably, in very, very violent conflict, that's even a step beyond what I just said. We stop killing each other. We haven't agreed on anything yet,
Right.
but we can agree to stop killing each other.
Right.
That's huge. And we hardly call it a win. We hardly say we're done when we.
Right.
There can still be a lot of very, very difficult issues to resolve, and a very high risk of getting back to the escalation pattern. But again, when we're in such difficult situations, just being able to get to the point where we're okay, let me say this, but I've been, doing a lot of my work dealt with Israeli-Palestinian issues, which is, not 2 years of conflict. We're talking about decades and decades of conflict there. And one of the, I think, major barriers to getting out of it is that, we have whole generations of people that have lived their entire life. And so I've lived my entire life in this conflict. So it's hard to get people into the point that they can even consider that it doesn't have to be this way. That's not something that's just a given, like the sun rising in the morning. It's
Right.
actually something that can be changed, that we might be able to do something about. That's major. Now, to tell you that will resolve anything, no, because. Yeah.
So that's an interesting, that's very interesting. Do you find in those situations, and I think I'm sure there are other conflicts, perhaps not as extreme, I'm not sure the right word, but do people's level then adjust to what conflict is? Your point is, it doesn't always need to be this way, which I agree but could there also be the repercussion of some people not even realizing this is conflict because it has always been that way, right? Like,
I think they realize it's conflict. Yeah. They realize it because they feel it. It affects them. It affects their lives. And again, you live in Israel. You know that it affects your everyday life because you walk through the gate at the university and you have to open your bag for somebody to check that there's not a bomb in there. But of course, every once in a while, we also have serious escalation, and rockets are being fired, and people are being enlisted to the military service, and that happens all the time. So we are aware that there's a conflict. I think where we're stuck is the ability to even imagine that it's possible
for not
that
to be.
that it doesn't have to be this way. This is actually something we're doing. Obviously, there's people on the other side that are doing it also, but it's something that people are doing. It's not something, again, it's not the sun rising in the morning, which we have no control over. It's something that people are doing, and yeah, I think that's a very major barrier that we're dealing with these days.
Are there some conflicts that just aren't solvable?
Well,
I guess
that's a sort
let
of
me back that up. Let me back that up. Is that a school of thought in your academic world? Is that a place where you and some of your colleagues may disagree or may not disagree? That some people feel there are just some things that can never be solved, and there's another school of thought that everything has, you know, there's a peaceful path. You just takes longer to find it.
Yeah, I think that no one's going to say that something can never be solved, because that depends on what's an acceptable solution. If you know,
Right. Okay.
typically this day and age, it's not, you know, and doesn't apply as an acceptable solution. It's just, you know, kill everybody and drop the nuclear bomb on them and just kill them. That'll solve things, but we, you know, that's not
within your field.
Not something we think about as an acceptable solution.
That's not so avoiding conflict or peaceful. Right.
Yeah. Yes, I'll tell you this. Look, I started getting into the studying conflicts. That it was the late 1999 is when I started my master's degree, and that's when I started studying this. At the time, if someone recalls Israeli history, at late 1990s, the feeling was that there's gonna be peace any day now. It's the feeling there was, you know, we're just on the verge, it's just about there, almost there. And what people were asking me back then was, is there even any point in going into this field? It's gonna be gone any day now, you'll have nothing to do. Well, clearly, you know, over 20 years later, I still have my job. But on the other hand, now people often ask me, isn't it, you know, depressing, and doesn't it make you, you know, give you a sense of despair to have been working on this for such a long time and still see this conflict waging and be very much active and so on? And my answer to that is, well, in a way, yes, it's pretty discouraging sometimes, but it would be even more so if I stopped. Because part of what happens in conflicts, and we know this, again, that's based in research, is that they're self-fulfilling prophecies. If we stop trying to change things, then they're definitely not going to change. If we keep trying to look at things in different ways, then possibly there's a chance we'll get to something sometimes. There's also an interview I like to show my students. I'm actually showing it to them next week in class from Desmond Tutu in South Africa, where he said, if you had asked me a year before apartheid ended, I would have said, no way is this ever changing. And then we know that it changed.
Right.
So we don't know. And
I guess before I take some of the questions, I actually just have sort of an interesting question for you. You know, why did you choose to study this? And then tell us a little bit about why some of your students are, you know, we have quite an extensive program at University of Haifa, which, you know, as a city, we're very proud for being known of being relatively conflict-free compared to, you know, our region, let alone our country. But so I know why it's so important, such a critical part of the university, but tell us how you came to this field, and then what are you seeing in your students, and maybe how has it changed over time, how they're coming to it?
So honestly, I came to it somewhat by accident. I came to the master's degree in social psychology very much wanting to study attitudes and attitude change, because I was actually starting a career in a firm that was doing a lot of marketing research and trying to figure out how to help companies, develop their products and so on. And that was my, reason for starting this. Through studying, I did my master's and then Ph.D. at Tel Aviv University. And I got to know the person who became my advisor and mentor, Professor Daniel Bartal of Tel Aviv University, who's a very well-known scholar in this field. And then I found myself just fascinated with that work, and that's the way I got into it. So there wasn't, a very strong ideology behind it in the first place. It just, once I started doing it, it became something that I was fascinated with, and over time realized that I could actually use to influence the world, not just for people to make a profit, but to actually do good things, hopefully. So now, what brings us this motivates our students? Well, unlike me, a lot of them are motivated by very idealistic motives. So a lot of the people do come to this program with the sense that they want to do something good in the world, or figure out a way to or get some tools to deal with very, very complicated problems that are causing a lot of pain and suffering. Not all of them, but do actually come from countries that are dealing with major conflicts and are, have the goal of going back home with some tools to do this. Others are more, generally hoping to get involved somewhere in the world, not necessarily in their specific back home. So a lot of our students end up going on, some have gone on UN missions, some who are from the United States have gone into the Peace Corps and have gone on humanitarian missions around the world. So they actually don't go back home, they go somewhere else where they can make an difference. But yeah, a lot of them come for these reasons, for actually wanting to do something in the world. A lot of them are also, for various reasons, very interested in Israel and the Middle East specifically, and come to study with because they want to be in that region and actually experience it firsthand, and not just read about it in the books and hear about it from the media. So that's something else that motivates many students to come to our program.
So it's interesting you say that, because you did some of your work in Switzerland, which is a very different environment, one would think, than say Israel.
Yeah, well, actually, I didn't. That's a mistake. I
apologize, but
yeah,
what do you?
It comes from the center I was affiliated with at the Hebrew University. It's called the Swiss Center for Conflict Research.
I'm sorry, but
it's in Jerusalem.
Yes, the Hebrew University. I'm sorry, but still, what do you think the difference is between studying peace and conflict in a region that, as you have said, has kind of lived under a very intense conflict, versus even, in the United States or somewhere else where why we might have spikes of conflict and social unrest as we're experiencing right now? It's, our level is much different. So how does that, is the academic approach different, or is it just, the way the students come, or what do you feel the difference is?
Yeah, the quite a few differences that I can talk about. One thing I noticed from the academic approach, so I did my work up to my PhD and then in Tel Aviv University. Then I had that year at the Hebrew University, and then I moved to the United States and did the 2 years at the University of Maryland. So that, and then went back to Israel. So in going to the United States, one of the things I noticed is that in a lot of specific types of phenomena or behavior that happen in the context of a conflict, the researchers in the United States looked at them sometimes in isolation from the specific context, but then across context. So for example, I was affiliated at the University of Maryland with the START Center, which is the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. So this was late 2000s, so there was a lot of post 9/11, a lot of interest in terrorism in the United States, and sometimes it felt to me like, oh, these people looking at terrorism as terrorism and not seeing that it takes place in very, very different contexts for very, very different reasons, because terrorism is conflict behavior by definition, it's violent behavior and so on. So it's usually an expression of some conflict going on where there's a broader context. So it's very, very different in different situations of conflict, and it sometimes seems to be like they're treating it as if it's just as if terrorism is its own phenomenon and unrelated to something broader happening, which was strange for me to move. There was also, of course, the beneficial side of that is actually looking again and being able to identify patterns that actually occur across contexts, which you can do when you're looking at one specific context. So in Israel, very much when you study conflict, it feels like something that's really, really immediate and immediately relevant to the things that are happening, and often sometimes you don't really take it to the bigger picture, even though that's what we try to do, and that's our role as scientists. Another observation was that as social psychologists, a lot of the research we do, we actually do at the university in a lab. So we simulate a lot of situations from the conflict, or we bring in situations from the conflict. And one major difference is that in Israel, anyone you bring into the lab, the conflict is still a part of their life. You can't just create something in a lab that's unrelated to the real world. So we always have to, come up with a very clever cover story that connects people to what's outside and what's inside. Conveniently for a researcher, but something that seems strange to me at first in the United States, you could bring people into the lab and just make things up, and they would go along with it, because there was nothing immediate that they needed to connect it to feel like this is realistic. And so I had to work a lot less to convince them that something's happening somewhere in the world and you need to take it seriously and do something about it, even though I was completely making it up. So yeah, that's another difference, I would say. That, yes, it's just not such an immediate part of people's lives. So for better or worse, that's right. How they come into the research.
Well, thank you very much. I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock, because I know we try to keep people, tell them we're only taking about a half an hour of their time. And given what's going on in the world, I think this is a subject that we could talk about forever. But, you know, we so appreciate your time and expertise, and even seeing the differentiations in the different countries. It's fascinating, and it'll be very exciting for us to see how those might change in the next couple of years, because we are becoming much more global and out of desire and out of necessity. So I feel quite fortunate that we have you and your colleagues developing the next generation of leaders who will take us through this very important part of society. If anyone has any more questions about the University of Haifa's Peace and Conflict Management Program, or University of Haifa in general, please feel free to reach out to us. You can email us at info@asuh.org, and we will get back to you or pass your questions on. And certainly, if you would like to support our Peace and Conflict Management Program, we would appreciate that very much as well. We're fortunate to have several people endowing and providing support for some of our scholars, but certainly, as everyone knows and is very aware of, the need for people with this kind of specialty is only growing. So your support is much appreciated. You can find out more information about that on our website as well, asuh.org. So I want to thank you all again for joining us today. We'll have a recording of this briefing available on our website, if not tomorrow, Sunday, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much.